Alfredo Trevino, the serial killer, doctor who inspired the cannibal character, Hannibal Lecter. Movies have produced myriads of scary villains, and some of the scariest villains of all time include imaginary characters like Dracula and Frankenstein. But among them, there is another villain, the cannibal, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, from the 1991 movie The Silence of the Lambs. An intriguing fact about this villain is that he is inspired by a real-life murderer named Alfredo Trevino. Hannibal Lecter was the creation of the Red Dragon writer Thomas Harris, and the character was influenced by an inmate from a Mexican prison. The personality of that inmate and his complete stature are what inspired the journalist to create his most famous serial killer. So, who was Alfredo Trevino, the doctor who inspired the creation of Hannibal Lecter, and how did his crimes come to life? Here's a rundown of fact versus fiction and the killer's whereabouts. Hannibal Lecter is a blend of many villains that have been heard of in real life and seen in movies. But there is this particular person who inspired the making of this maniac serial killer, Alfredo Trevino. Thomas Harris had been a journalist in the 1960s, and once he had to meet a gruesomely wounded prisoner, Dykes Askew Simmons, in a prison in Mexico. He had been sentenced to death for a triple murder. Treating Simmons was a doctor named Dr. Salazar, whom Harris mistook to be a staff member. While Salazar treated Simmons after he was shot during an escape attempt, the journalist and the doctor had quite an intellectual conversation concerning Simmons's victims. Little did Harris know that the doctor was a murderer himself who was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. This man became the inspiration for Harris's horror movie icon. Harris actually described Trevino as a small, lithe man with dark red hair who stood very still, but also, there was a certain elegance about him. Surely the man wasn't suspected of the gruesome crime he had committed that led to his incarceration. The chilling silence of the Lambs scene where Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, interacted with the young FBI agent Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, is what transpired between Trevino and Harris. To the author's surprise, a prison warden informed him of the truth, identifying Trevino as a doctor-turned-murderer. As a surgeon, he could package his victim in a surprisingly small box. The warden explained, adding, "He will never leave this place. He is insane." But how did Dr. Salazar end up in prison? Alfredo Trevino was known as Dr. Salazar when he was in prison, and Harris went along with it to protect Trevino's identity. To the outside world, he was more familiar as the Wolfman of Nuevo Leon. This doctor from Monterrey was sentenced to death for murdering his gay lover Jesus Castillo Rangel by slitting his throat and mutilating the body before burying the chopped-up pieces of the victim's body in an empty lot. The physician killed his lover in a fit of anger as the former was trying to get married to a woman. Trevino is also suspected of murdering several hitchhikers in the late 1950s and 1960s. He spent his life in the Nuevo Leon State Prison for 20 years and was released in 1980. Once out of prison, Trevino continued his medical practice. He tried to turn a new leaf in his life and helped the poor and elderly in his old age. In his last recorded interview in 2008, Alfredo Trevino said, "I don't want to relive my dark past. I don't want to wake up my ghosts. It's very hard. The past is heavy, and the truth is that this angst I have is unbearable." The infamous criminal passed away in 2009 at the age of 81 due to cancer.